The crystal flute snapped in Julian Thorne's grip. A faint crystalline crack, barely audible above the orchestra's soaring crescendo, but for him, it was a thunderclap that silenced the world. A single, perfect shard of glass pricked his thumb, and a ruby droplet of blood welled up, a stark blemish against his light olive skin. He stared at it, mesmerized, as the champagne bled out between his fingers, fizzing over the pristine white marble of the ballroom floor. It wasn't the glass that had shattered his composure. It was the girl. She stood not 10 feet away, a ghost at the feast, a smudge of soot on a silk canvas. Security, a legion of men in sharp, dark suits with coiled wires in their ears, formed a useless, panicked semicircle around her, their professional poise melting into baffled hesitation. She was tiny, perhaps 7 years old, with skin like porcelain and hair the color of spun moonlight tamed into a single, neat braid. Her dress was a threadbare thing of faded blue, and her feet were bare, smudged with the grime of the city. But it was her eyes that held him captive. They were a deep, stormy gray, the color of the ocean just before a squall, and they were fixed on him with an intensity that belied her age. She held a small, wilting daisy in her hand, its petals bruised and curling. She took a step forward, the security cordon tightening instinctively. "Mr. Thorne," she whispered, her voice a fragile bird's song in the cavernous hall. "You have to help us, please. Mama said you were the only one who could." Julian's jaw tightened, the muscle fluttering in his cheek. He placed the broken stem of the flute onto a passing waiter's tray, with a hand that was unnervingly steady, ignoring the man's stammered apology. He dabbed his thumb with a linen napkin, his movements precise, controlled, clinical. He was a man who commanded industries, who shifted global markets with a single phone call, whose life was a fortress of order and impenetrable logic. A child, a street urchin, had breached its walls. It was an anomaly, an error in the code of his meticulously curated existence, and it had to be purged. He met her gaze, his own eyes cold and dark as polished obsidian. "I believe you are mistaken," he said, his voice smooth and low, yet carrying an edge of dismissal that could cut steel. "I don't know you, or your mother." He gave a curt, almost imperceptible nod to the head of his security detail, a man named Marcus who had been with him for a decade. The signal was clear. Remove the aberration. Marcus moved forward, his large frame gentle but firm, his hand outstretched. "Come on, little one," he murmured, his voice a low rumble. "Let's find our way out of here. This is no place for you." The girl didn't flinch. She didn't look at the giant of a man beside her. Her gray eyes remained locked on Julian's, and in their depths, he saw not fear, but a flicker of something that looked unnervingly like disappointment, a profound and ancient sorrow that had no business being in the face of a child. It was this look, more than the intrusion, more than the broken glass, that stirred an unwelcome and unfamiliar irritation deep within him. It was a chaotic variable in a life built on constants. He turned away, a deliberate, final gesture, signaling to the orchestra conductor to resume, signaling to the murmuring guests that the brief, bizarre interruption was over. He was Julian Thorne. He did not engage with destitution. He funded foundations. He endowed charities. He wrote checks with an astonishing number of zeros. But he did it from a distance, through layers of assistants and accountants. He dealt in solutions on a macro scale, in percentages and impact reports. He did not deal in individual grubby-faced tragedies holding wilting flowers. As Marcus gently took her arm, she finally spoke again, her voice rising slightly, clear and piercing. "But we're the same," she insisted, a desperate tremor shaking the words. "Mama said so. She said you would understand." Julian paused, his back still to her. The same. The notion was absurd. He was the master of a financial empire, a titan of modern capitalism. She was nothing. A statistical rounding error in the city's poverty metrics. He took another step, eager to put distance between them, to cleanse the sterile air of his world from her cloying scent of rain and desperation. He could feel the eyes of every guest on him, their curiosity piqued. He needed to re-establish control. But the small voice piped up one last time, not with a plea, but with a statement of fact. A puzzle piece laid on a table. "The moon and the star," she said, her voice suddenly small and filled with a strange sort of wonder. "On our skin. Mine's right here." Julian froze mid-stride. The world seemed to tilt on its axis, the muffled sounds of the gala fading into a distant, roaring hum in his ears. Moon and star. It was a childish phrase, a line from a forgotten lullaby, a secret whispered in the dark between two lovers a lifetime ago. A secret he had buried along with his heart. He slowly, mechanically turned back around. Marcus had stopped, his hand hovering over the girl's shoulder, his own face a mask of confusion. The girl, seeing she had Julian's attention again, pulled up the sleeve of her worn dress. There, on the delicate skin of her left wrist, was a birthmark. It was a perfect pale brown crescent, and nestled just within its curve was a tiny, distinct speckle, like a lone star watching over a sleeping moon. Julian's breath hitched in his chest. His blood ran cold, then hot, a dizzying, nauseating surge. He felt the phantom weight of the broken glass in his hand, the sting of the cut on his thumb. Without conscious thought, his own right hand moved, his fingers fumbling with the ridiculously expensive cufflink on his shirt. He pulled the starched white fabric back, baring his own wrist. And there, on his skin, a mirror image of the girl's mark, was the same pale brown crescent, the same solitary star. A brand. A map. A ghost, the fortress he had built around himself, stone by meticulous stone over 8 long years, crumbled into dust. The silence in the ballroom was now absolute. The orchestra had faltered to a stop, a violin sighing a final, mournful note into the void. Hundreds of pairs of eyes, belonging to the city's elite, darted from the billionaire's wrist to the child's, a collective, unspoken gasp rippling through the crowd. They were seeing the impossible, a connection so bizarre, so intimate, it felt like a page torn from a fairy tale and dropped into their world of cold, hard assets. Julian couldn't breathe. He was no longer in the grand ballroom of Thorn Tower. He was back in a tiny, 4th-floor walk-up apartment that always smelled of turpentine and lavender, the one he used to escape to, away from the suffocating grandeur of his inheritance. He was with her, with Anya. Her laughter echoed in the hollow chambers of his memory, her fingers tracing the mark on his wrist as she lay beside him, her head on his chest. "Look," she had whispered, her own wrist held up next to his in the dim pre-dawn light. "The moon and his lonely star. We're a constellation, you and I. A secret sky." He had loved the way she saw the world, a canvas of poetry and wonder, so different from his own world of balance sheets and brutal pragmatism. She had been his beautiful, brilliant, impossible secret, a vibrant artist from the wrong side of the tracks, a woman his family would never, and did not, approve of. They had married in secret, a simple ceremony at a courthouse with 2 strangers as witnesses, and for a year he had known a happiness so pure and profound it terrified him. Then came the fire. A faulty wire, the investigators had said, a tragic accident. His secret apartment, his secret life, his Anya. All turned to ash. He had been in Zurich, closing a deal that had made him another billion he didn't need. He had identified her from a wedding band his family didn't know he'd bought. They had told him she was gone, that his whole world was gone. He had accepted it. He had buried the man he was with her, and from the ashes Julian Thorne, the machine, had risen. Now that machine was sputtering, its gears grinding against an impossible, undeniable truth. The girl. Lily, she had called herself on the way in, when a bewildered security guard at the service entrance had asked her name. The name on the birth certificate he had framed and hidden in the back of his vault was Lilia. Lilia Thorne, named after the wildflowers Anya had loved. His mind raced, a frantic, chaotic scramble to process, to analyze, to reject. It was a coincidence, a trick, a cruel, elaborate hoax designed to prey on a forgotten grief. There were people who knew his story, the few confidants he'd had before he'd excised them all from his life. Someone could have found this girl, coached her, told her about the mark. But who? And how? The existence of his wife, let alone a child, was a secret buried deeper than any corporate strategy. He had paid fortunes to ensure it remained that way, to protect Anya's memory from the voracious, cynical glare of the public eye. He looked at the girl again. Her face. He had been so blinded by the shock of the mark, he hadn't truly seen her. But now he did. The stubborn set of her jaw was his. The slight upturn of her nose was his. But her eyes were pure Anya. That same stormy gray, filled with a fierce, untamable spirit. He felt a tremor start in his hands, a deep, visceral shudder that had nothing to do with the broken glass. The control he prized above all else was slipping through his fingers like fine sand. Marcus. Julian's voice was a rough rasp, a foreign sound in his own throat. Take her to my office. Now. No one speaks to her. No one touches her. Get her a blanket and some warm milk. And some of those little chocolate biscuits from the tin in the pantry, the ones with the stars on them. The specificity of the last order hung in the air, a strangely domestic detail in a moment of earth-shattering import. Marcus, his face a mixture of shock and dawning understanding, simply nodded. He knelt down, his movements slow, as if approaching a fawn. "Okay, Lily," he said softly. "You heard the man. Let's go somewhere quiet." The girl, Lily, finally looked away from Julian. She placed her small hand in Marcus's enormous one without hesitation, her trust absolute. As she was led away, her small, bare feet silent on the polished floor, she turned her head one last time and looked back at him. The despair was gone from her eyes, replaced by a quiet, unwavering certainty. It was the look of someone who had finally come home. Julian stood frozen, the blood on his thumb now dry, his world irrevocably fractured. The murmurs in the room grew louder, a buzzing hive of speculation and scandal. He ignored them. He saw only the ghost of a woman with paint on her fingers and laughter in her eyes, and heard her whisper across the chasm of 8 impossible years. Our secret sky, Julian. Our constellation. He had thought his star had burned out, but it seemed it had only been lost, wandering in the darkness, waiting to be found. And now, the map had led her back to him. The question that screamed in the sudden, terrifying silence of his soul was what on earth was he supposed to do now? He moved through the rest of the evening in a fugue state. He delivered his keynote address, the words flowing from him with practiced ease, but his mind was elsewhere, replaying the moment in the ballroom, the sight of that impossible birthmark. He shook hands, smiled for cameras, and accepted accolades for his company's record-breaking philanthropic donations, a bitter irony that tasted like ash in his mouth. He wrote checks to solve the world's problems in the abstract, yet he had almost turned away the living, breathing heart of his own collapsed universe. He left early, a breach of protocol he couldn't bring himself to care about. The elevator ride to the penthouse, which doubled as his office and residence, was a journey through a tunnel of suffocating silence. The doors slid open to reveal Marcus standing sentinel outside the heavy oak doors of his study. "She's inside, sir," Marcus said, his voice low and respectful, but his eyes were full of questions Julian had no answers for. She drank the milk and ate a few biscuits. Then she fell asleep in the armchair. Julian nodded, his throat tight. He pushed the doors open and stepped inside. The room was his sanctuary, a testament to his life of order. Floor-to-ceiling windows revealed a panoramic, glittering vista of the city he owned. The shelves were lined with first editions and priceless art. A massive mahogany desk stood at its center, clean and uncluttered. And curled up in one of the large leather armchairs by the unlit fireplace was the girl. A cashmere throw blanket, one he kept for late nights at the office, was draped over her. Her small chest rose and fell in the steady rhythm of sleep. Her face in repose was angelic, free from the worry and desperation that had etched it earlier. The wilting daisy lay on the side table next to an empty glass and a plate with a few biscuit crumbs. Seeing her there, so small and vulnerable in the heart of his empire, was a cognitive dissonance that made his head spin. She did not belong here, and yet he felt a pull, a magnetic, primal urge to protect her that frightened him more than any corporate takeover. He walked over to the chair and knelt, his expensive suit trousers creasing on the plush carpet. He looked at her wrist, where the sleeve of her dress had ridden up, revealing the birthmark again. The moon and the star. He reached out a hesitant hand, his fingers trembling slightly, and gently brushed a stray strand of blonde hair from her forehead. Her skin was soft, warm, real. He felt a sudden, overwhelming wave of grief and rage. Grief for the 8 years he had lost. 8 birthdays, 8 Christmases. First words, first steps, scraped knees, and bedtime stories. An entire childhood stolen from him, and rage at himself, for his blindness, for his cowardice. He had let his family's disapproval and his own ambition keep Anya and his unborn child a secret. He had told himself it was to protect them from the toxicity of his world. But he knew, in the unflinching honesty of this moment, that it was also to protect himself. To keep his perfect, orderly life from being complicated by messy, unpredictable love. When he lost her, it was easier to cauterize the wound, to lock the memories away, than to face the gaping hole she had left behind. He had chosen emptiness over pain. And what had it cost him? He looked at the sleeping child, a living embodiment of his greatest love and his greatest failure. He needed answers. He stood up and walked to his desk, pulling out his phone. He dialed a number he hadn't called in years. It rang twice before a gravelly voice answered. "Thorne, to what do I owe the resurrection?" "I need you, Gavin," Julian said, his voice strained. "Something's happened. I need your best people. Discretion is absolute. I'm sending you a file. I want to know everything about a fire at a tenement building on the west side, 8 years ago, April 12th. And I need a DNA sample kit brought here, to my office, tonight." There was a pause on the other end of the line, then a low whistle. A fire 8 years ago? And a DNA kit? Julian, what the hell is going on? Gavin was his former head of security, a man who had retired after a career built on unearthing secrets others would kill to keep hidden. He was the only person who had known about Anya. "Just do it, Gavin," Julian said, his voice breaking slightly. I think my daughter might be alive." The hours that followed were the longest of Julian's life. Gavin's man, a quiet professional with the air of a mortician, arrived with the DNA kit. He took a gentle swab from the inside of the sleeping girl's cheek, then one from Julian. He sealed them in tamper-proof bags and left as silently as he had come. Gavin had promised to put a rush on it, pulling every string he had. The results would be back in 24 hours. A lifetime. While Lily slept on, Julian sat at his desk, the city lights twinkling below like a fallen constellation. He tried to work, to lose himself in the familiar comfort of numbers and projections, but the words on the screen blurred into nonsense. His mind was a whirlwind of memories and fears. He remembered Anya telling him she was pregnant, her gray eyes shining with a mixture of joy and terror. They had been in that small apartment, a secret world of their own making. He had promised her he would tell his family, that they would build a proper life together, out in the open. But he had delayed. He had always found one more reason, one more deal to close, one more quarter to get through. He had told himself he was building a secure future for them, but the truth was, he was afraid. Afraid of his father's disappointment, of the family's inevitable rejection of the woman he adored. His cowardice had kept them in the shadows. And then the fire had stolen his chance to make it right. Or so he had thought. Now this child, this impossible miracle, was offering him a second chance he knew he didn't deserve. What kind of father could he be? He was a man who communicated through memos and intermediaries, who hadn't eaten a meal with another person, outside of a business context, in years. His heart was an atrophied muscle. He didn't know the first thing about scraped knees or bedtime stories. The girl stirred in her sleep, a small whimper escaping her lips. Julian was by her side in an instant, a strange, protective instinct surging through him. He knelt again, watching as her face scrunched up, her breathing quickening. A nightmare. He found himself humming, a low, tuneless sound. It was the melody of a lullaby Anya used to hum while she sketched, a forgotten tune from her own childhood. The girl's breathing evened out, her features relaxing as she sank back into a deeper sleep. Julian stayed there, kneeling on the floor, watching her, until the first gray fingers of dawn began to creep over the city skyline. He felt a profound shift within him, a tectonic realignment of his entire being. His empire of steel and glass suddenly felt cold and meaningless. All the wealth, all the power, it was nothing but a hollow shell. For the first time in 8 years, he felt a flicker of warmth in the frozen wasteland of his heart. It was terrifying, and it was hope. When Lily finally woke, the morning sun was streaming through the windows, bathing the office in a golden light. She sat up, rubbing her eyes, the large cashmere blanket pooling around her. She looked around the vast, opulent room with a child's unfiltered wonder, her gaze lingering on the towering shelves of books and the strange, abstract sculptures. Then her eyes found Julian, who was standing by the window, a cup of coffee untouched in his hand. He hadn't slept. He had spent the night watching her, a silent, fearful vigil. A small smile touched her lips. "Good morning," she said, her voice clear and bright. "Good morning," Julian replied, his voice hoarse. He cleared his throat. "Are you hungry? I can have a chef make you anything you want. Pancakes? Waffles?" She considered this with the gravity only a 7-year-old can muster. "Can I have toast? With strawberry jam? That's what Mama Ilara makes me for a treat." The name sent a jolt through him. Mama Ilara, the woman who had raised his daughter. Who was she? How had she found her? Questions swirled, but he pushed them down. One step at a time. "Of course," he said, his voice softer than he'd intended. "Toast with strawberry jam it is." He ordered the breakfast, and they ate in a strange, companionable silence at a small table he had Marcus bring in. Lily ate with a delicate precision, taking small bites and carefully wiping her mouth with a napkin. She had Anya's grace. He watched her, cataloging every detail. The way she tilted her head when she was thinking, the little furrow that appeared between her brows. He was starving for these details, for the 8 years of them he had missed. After she had finished, she looked at him, her gray eyes serious. "Are you going to help my mama?" she asked, her voice quiet but firm. "She's sick. The doctor said she needs special medicine, but it costs a lot of money. More money than all the stars in the sky." The simple, heartbreaking poetry of her words struck him. This wasn't a scheme for money. This was a child, desperate to save the only mother she had ever known. "Yes," Julian said, the word coming out with a certainty that surprised him. "I'm going to help your mama. I'm going to make sure she has the best doctors, the best medicine, I promise." Lily's face broke into a radiant smile, a beam of pure sunlight that seemed to illuminate the entire room. She slid off her chair, ran to him, and wrapped her small arms around his legs in a fierce hug. "Thank you," she whispered into the fabric of his trousers. Julian froze, his body rigid with unfamiliarity. He hadn't been touched with such simple, uncomplicated affection in years. Hesitantly, he reached down and placed a hand on her head, his fingers sinking into the softness of her blonde hair. He felt a crack in the ice around his heart, a painful, thawing sensation. He was a stranger to this child, and yet she had trusted him. She had seen something in him he thought was long dead. Later that day, Gavin called. "I have something," he said, his voice grim. "The fire report. It was officially ruled an accident. Faulty wiring in the unit below. But I dug deeper, Julian. I pulled the coroner's report. They only found one body." Julian's heart hammered against his ribs. "What are you saying, Gavin?" "The victim, a Jane Doe at the time, was identified by a dental partial and a wedding band. She died of smoke inhalation. There was no one else with her, Julian. No infant. No child's remains. Nothing." The room seemed to shrink around him. All these years he had believed he had lost both of them. The official report, relayed to him by his family's lawyers while he was numb with grief, had been clear. His wife and unborn child were gone. But it had been a lie. Or at the very least, a gross, unforgivable oversight. "She had the baby," Julian whispered, the realization dawning on him. "She must have had the baby." "Looks that way," Gavin said. "There's more. Anya's wallet was missing from the scene, and a neighbor reported seeing a woman running from the building carrying a bundle just as the first alarm sounded. The police dismissed it at the time, thought it was a looter taking advantage of the chaos. They never followed up." A woman carrying a bundle. Mama Ilara. It had to be. His daughter hadn't been abandoned. She had been rescued, saved from the flames that had taken her mother. The wave of gratitude he felt towards this unknown woman was so powerful, it brought him to his knees. He sank into his chair, the phone still pressed to his ear. Lily, who had been quietly drawing with a set of pens and paper he'd found for her, looked up, her brow furrowed with concern. "Are you okay?" she asked. He couldn't speak. He could only nod, a maelstrom of emotions raging within him: relief, guilt, sorrow, and a terrifying, burgeoning love. The DNA results were still hours away, but in his heart, he no longer needed them. He knew. This was his Lilia, his daughter, and he had a lifetime of lost time to make up for. The first step was finding Alara. He dispatched a team, not of his corporate fixers, but of discreet medical professionals and social workers Gavin recommended. He gave them the address Lily had given him, a tenement on the other side of the city, a world away from his glass tower. He instructed them to be gentle, to offer help without overwhelming her, and to assess what she needed immediately. He wanted to go himself, to burst into her life and demand answers, to thank her, to rage at her for not finding him sooner. But he knew he couldn't. This required a delicacy he did not possess. He was a blunt instrument in a world of fragile emotions. And more importantly, his place was here, with Lily. She was his priority now, his only priority. He spent the rest of the day with her, a strange and surreal bubble of domesticity in his corporate sanctum. He learned that her full name was Lily Rose, that her favorite color was yellow, that she was terrified of spiders, and that she believed squirrels were tiny, fluffy ninjas. She chattered on, and he listened, hanging on every word, every small revelation, a precious gift. He found himself telling her about the stars, pointing out constellations from his window, a subject he hadn't thought about since his university astronomy classes. He was clumsy, awkward, a man learning a foreign language. But Lily didn't seem to notice. She looked at him with an open, accepting heart, as if he were already the father he was so terrified he could never be. Late that afternoon, the call came. It was Gavin. "Julian," he said, his voice unusually soft. "It's a match. 999%. Congratulations, old friend. She's yours." Julian closed his eyes, the words washing over him, a final, definitive wave. The last shred of doubt, the tiny, cynical voice in his head that had whispered it was all a trick, was silenced forever. She was his. He ended the call and looked at Lily, who was carefully coloring a picture of a yellow sun. A tear slid down his cheek, the first he had shed since the day he was told Anya was gone. He quickly wiped it away, but not before Lily saw it. She put down her crayon and walked over to him, her small face a mask of concern. She reached up a tiny hand and placed it on his cheek. "Why are you sad?" she asked. "Did I do something wrong?" Julian shook his head, a choked sob escaping him. He scooped her up in his arms, holding her tightly against his chest, burying his face in her soft, clean-smelling hair. He was clumsy, but he held her as if she were the most precious thing in the universe because she was. "No, little one," he whispered, his voice thick with emotion. "You didn't do anything wrong. You did everything right." He held her for a long time, the setting sun casting long shadows across the room, the silence filled only by the sound of their breathing. He was a father. The thought was both the most terrifying and the most wonderful thing he had ever known. His life of empty, sterile order was over. It had been shattered by a 7-year-old girl with her mother's eyes and a secret sky on her wrist. And in its place, something new, something terrifying and beautiful, was beginning to grow. The next morning, Julian made a decision that sent shockwaves through his company. He cleared his schedule. Indefinitely. Meetings were canceled, deals were postponed. He informed his board that he was taking a personal leave of absence, effective immediately. He ignored their panicked calls and protests. For the first time in his adult life, his work was not his priority. He had a daughter to get to know, and he had a woman to meet. The medical team had reported back. Alara was in her late 70s, suffering from a severe respiratory illness exacerbated by the poor living conditions. She was weak but lucid, and she was fiercely protective of Lily. She had been wary of the help offered, suspicious of its source, until the social worker gently explained that a concerned benefactor, a friend of Lily's, wanted to ensure they were both cared for. No names were mentioned. Julian knew he had to be the one to tell her the truth. He and Lily took a car to the address, a far cry from the sleek, silent limousine he usually traveled in. It was a simple black sedan driven by Marcus. Julian wanted to appear as unthreatening as possible. As they drove from the gleaming steel and glass of the financial district into the crumbling brick and graffiti-strewn streets of the West Side, the chasm between their two worlds became starkly, painfully apparent. He had lived in this city his entire life and had never once set foot in this neighborhood. He had insulated himself from its reality, treating it as a problem to be solved with data points and charitable trusts, not as a place where people, where his daughter, lived and breathed and struggled. The building was a grim 5-story walk-up, its facade stained with years of pollution. The air in the hallway was thick with the smell of damp and boiled cabbage. Julian's hand tightened on Lily's as they climbed the rickety stairs to the 4th floor. Lily seemed unfazed, skipping up the steps ahead of him. This was her home. The thought was a knife in his gut. She led him to a door at the end of the hall and pushed it open. "Mama Ilara, I'm home, and I brought a friend." The apartment was tiny, a single room that served as a kitchen, living room, and bedroom. It was sparsely furnished but immaculately clean. Every surface was scrubbed, every meager possession neatly in its place. A small woman with a cloud of white hair and eyes as bright and sharp as a bird's was sitting up in a bed in the corner, propped up by pillows. An oxygen tube was clipped to her nose. When she saw Julian, her bright eyes narrowed with suspicion. "Lilybug, who is this man?" she asked, her voice a frail, reedy thing, but with an undercurrent of steel. "This is my friend," Lily said happily, running to her and giving her a gentle hug. "He's the one who's going to help you get better." Julian stepped forward, his heart pounding. This was her, the woman who had run into a burning building to save his child, the woman who had raised her, loved her, kept her safe for 8 years on what was clearly next to nothing. How did you begin a conversation like that? "My name is Julian Thorne," he began, his voice sounding too loud in the small room. Ilara's eyes widened slightly, a flicker of recognition. She had likely seen his face in the news, on the covers of magazines. "You're a long way from home, Mr. Thorne," she said, her tone guarded. "What business does a man like you have with the likes of us?" Julian took a deep breath. There was no easy way to do this. He knelt so he was on eye level with her, a gesture of deference, of respect. "8 years ago," he said, his voice low and steady, "there was a fire in this building. You saved a child from that fire. A baby girl." Ilara's face went pale. Her hand, thin and papery, clutched the blanket at her chest. "I don't know what you're talking about." "Please," Julian said, his voice cracking with the effort of holding his emotions in check. "I'm not here to cause trouble. I'm here to thank you. And to understand." He looked at Lily, who was watching them both with wide, curious eyes. "Lily, my sweet, would you mind going into the hall for just a minute? I need to speak with Mama Ilara about grown-up things." Lily looked from his face to Ilara's, and seeing the quiet plea in his eyes, she nodded and slipped out of the room, leaving the door slightly ajar. Julian turned back to Ilara. "That little girl," he said, his voice thick with unshed tears, "is my daughter." Ilara stared at him, her sharp eyes searching his face, looking for any sign of deceit. She saw only a raw, desperate grief. She sagged back against the pillows, a long, shuddering sigh escaping her lips. "I always knew this day might come," she whispered. "I always knew she wasn't mine. Not really. She was too special, like a little star that had fallen from the sky." She began to talk, her voice gaining strength as she relived the memory. She had lived in the apartment next door to a young woman, a quiet, beautiful artist who kept to herself. Anya. Ilara had seen that she was pregnant and had taken to leaving small portions of soup or stew outside her door, worried the young woman wasn't eating enough. On the night of the fire, Ilara was woken by the smell of smoke. She had run into the hallway and saw the flames licking at Anya's door. She heard a baby crying. Without a second thought, she had thrown her old damp coat over her head and burst into the room. Anya was on the floor, barely conscious, pointing towards a makeshift bassinet in the corner. "Take her," Anya had gasped, her voice choked with smoke. "Get Lilia out." Ilara had scooped up the wailing infant, wrapped her in a blanket, and fled. She had looked back once from the street just as the roof collapsed. She never saw Anya again. In the chaos that followed, no one had come looking for a baby. The authorities were overwhelmed. Ilara, a lonely widow with no family of her own, couldn't bear to hand the child over to the system. She had found a purpose, a reason to live, in that tiny, ash-stained bundle. She had named her Lily because she had blossomed in the midst of tragedy. She had given her all the love she had. I looked for her father, Ilara said, tears streaming down her wrinkled cheeks. I swear I did, but Anya never spoke of him. There were no pictures, no letters, just a small locked box I could never open. I didn't know who to find, so I loved her. I hope that was enough. It was more than enough, Julian said, his own tears falling freely now. You saved her life. You gave her a life. You gave her love when I wasn't here to do it. There is no debt in this world great enough to repay you for that. He reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, ornate key. It was the key to the post office box where he and Anya used to leave letters for each other, a relic he had kept for no reason he could name. On a hunch, he had brought it with him. He held it out to Ilara. "The locked box," he said. "May I see it?" Ilara nodded towards a small cedar chest at the foot of her bed. Julian took it and placed it on his lap. The small key slid into the lock and turned with a faint click. He lifted the lid. Inside, nestled on a bed of faded velvet, was a collection of letters, all in Anya's elegant script, all addressed to him. There were sketches of him, of her, of their life together. And underneath it all was a legal document. It was a copy of their marriage certificate, and another, a sworn affidavit, notarized and dated just a week before the fire. In it, Anya officially named him Julian Thorne as the father of her child, Lilia Anya Thorne, and detailed her fears that his family would try to take the baby from her. She had been creating a paper trail, a way to protect her daughter, a way to ensure he could find her if anything ever happened. He had been so wrapped up in his own world of corporate intrigue, he had never imagined the battles she had been fighting on her own. He closed the box, his hands shaking. He had failed her so profoundly, but Ilara had not. This brave, selfless woman had been the guardian angel his wife had prayed for. "You will want to take her with you now," Ilara said softly, her voice filled with a heartbreaking resignation. "She belongs with you. She deserves a life I could never give her." Julian looked at the frail woman in the bed, a woman who had sacrificed everything for his child, and felt a fierce, protective loyalty. "Lily belongs with her family," Julian said, his voice firm with a newfound conviction. "And you, Ilara, are her family. You are her grandmother in every way that matters. Which makes you my family, too." He stood up, his path suddenly, startlingly clear. "You are not staying in this place another night. I own a house in the countryside, a quiet place with gardens and clean air. There are doctors there, the best in the world. I'm taking you there. I'm taking both of you there. We are going to get you well. And we are going to be a family. All of us." Ilara stared at him, speechless, her bird-like eyes wide with disbelief. Then, for the first time, a real, genuine smile touched her lips, a smile that lit up her tired face. "Lily Bug always did have a knack for finding stray miracles," she whispered. He called Lily back into the room. She ran to Ilara's bedside, sensing the change in the atmosphere. The tension was gone, replaced by a fragile, tentative peace. "Mama Ilara," Lily said, her voice filled with excitement. "Is my friend going to be your friend, too?" Ilara reached out and took Lily's hand. Then she reached for Julian's, her thin, cool fingers closing around both of them. "Yes, Lilybug," she said, her eyes shining with unshed tears as she looked at Julian. "I think he is." In that small, shabby room, surrounded by the ghosts of his past and the unexpected shape of his future, Julian Thorne finally felt the fractured pieces of his life begin to knit themselves back together. It wasn't the neat, orderly picture he had once prized. It was messy, complicated, and uncertain. But for the first time in a very long time, it felt whole. It felt like home. The transition was a whirlwind, Within hours, a private ambulance, staffed with a gentle and reassuring medical team, had arrived to transport Ilara. Julian had watched as they carefully settled her in, ensuring she was comfortable and warm. He had held her hand before they closed the doors. "I will see you at the house," he had promised. She had simply squeezed his hand, her eyes conveying a depth of gratitude that needed no words. While she was on her way, Julian had taken Lily on a shopping trip. It was an experience for which nothing in his life had prepared him. He, a man who acquired companies, now stood bewildered in the brightly colored aisles of a children's clothing store. But Lily, with her innate sense of wonder, turned it into an adventure. She delighted in dresses that twirled, shoes that lit up, and a soft, fluffy coat the color of a lemon. She wasn't greedy or demanding. She simply took joy in the novelty of it all. He bought her everything she pointed at, a clumsy, extravagant attempt to make up for 8 years of threadbare dresses. He watched her preen in front of a mirror, a radiant smile on her face, and realized that her happiness was now the most valuable commodity in his world. They arrived at the country estate just as the sun was setting. It was a sprawling stone house set amongst rolling hills and ancient oak trees, a place he had bought as an investment and had rarely visited. It had always felt too quiet, too empty. Now, seeing it through Lily's eyes as she gasped in wonder at the sheer size of the garden, it felt different. It felt like it had a purpose. Ilara was already settled in a large, airy downstairs bedroom with a view of the rose garden. A full-time nurse was in attendance, and a team of specialists was scheduled to arrive the next morning. The relief on Ilara's face as she lay in the comfortable bed, breathing the clean country air, was palpable. "It's like a palace," she whispered as Julian and Lily came to her bedside. "I feel like a queen." "You are a queen, Mama Ilara," Lily said, clambering onto the bed to give her a gentle hug. Those first few weeks were a delicate dance of getting to know one another. Julian learned to read bedtime stories, his deep voice at first stiff and formal, then gradually softening as he found the rhythms of the narratives. He learned that Lily liked her toast cut into triangles, not squares. He learned how to braid her hair, his large, clumsy fingers slowly becoming more adept at weaving the silken blonde strands. He spent hours with Ilara, listening to her stories about Lily's childhood. He heard about her first word, kitty, her first step, a wobbly dash towards a stray butterfly, and the time she had tried to make a potion out of mud and flower petals in the park. Each story was a precious, painful gift, a glimpse into the life he had missed. Hidi, in turn, found himself opening up to Ilara, telling her about Anya, about their secret love, about the dreams they had shared. He showed her the sketches from the cedar box, and together they mourned the brilliant, vibrant woman they had both loved. Through sharing their memories, they forged a bond, a quiet, solid friendship built on their mutual love for the little girl who connected them. As Ilara's health began to improve under the constant care, a new routine settled over the house. Mornings were for lessons. Julian hired a private tutor, a warm, patient young woman who made learning a game for Lily. Afternoons were for adventures. The three of them, Julian, Lily, and Ilara, who was now strong enough for short excursions in a wheelchair, would explore the estate. They had picnics by the lake, fed the ducks, and planted a small vegetable garden. Julian, the man who once commanded boardrooms, now found a profound satisfaction in the simple act of digging in the dirt with his daughter, their hands covered in soil. He was discovering a capacity for joy he thought had died with Anya. He was learning how to be a father, and he was learning how to be a man again, not the cold, unfeeling machine he had become, but a person capable of love and laughter. But the outside world could not be kept at bay forever. The story of the mysterious girl at the Thorn Foundation Gala and Julian's subsequent disappearance from public life had become a frenzy of media speculation. Paparazzi helicopters buzzed over the estate. Tabloids published wild, unsubstantiated stories. His family, who he had been avoiding, grew more insistent. His father, a formidable patriarch who had built the original Thorn Empire on ruthless ambition, demanded a meeting. Julian knew he could not hide forever. He had to face them. He had to claim his daughter, not just in his heart, but in the world. He arranged a meeting at the family's ancestral mansion in the city, a cold, museum-like place he had always hated. He left Lily in the care of Ilara and her nurse, promising he would be back by nightfall. Walking into the formal drawing room felt like stepping back in time. His father, Arthur Thorne, stood by the fireplace, his face a mask of stern disapproval. His younger sister, Clara, perched nervously on a silk settee. "Julian," his father began, forgoing any greeting, "this circus has gone on long enough. You have become a laughingstock. Who is this child? Some grifter's brat you've taken pity on? You will issue a statement, deny everything, and this foolishness will end." Julian looked at his father, at the man whose approval he had craved and feared his entire life, and felt nothing. The power his father held over him was gone, burned away by the transformative fire of his love for Lily. "Her name is Lilia," Julian said, his voice calm and clear. "She is not a grifter's brat. She is my daughter. She is Anya's daughter. Your granddaughter." Arthur's face contorted in a sneer. "Anya? That artist. I thought we were done with that sordid affair. She died. The child died with her." "You were wrong," Julian said, his voice dropping to a dangerous low. "She didn't, and I have the proof. A marriage certificate, a birth certificate, a DNA test. She is a Thorn, and you will treat her with the respect she deserves." "Respect?" Arthur laughed, a harsh, humorless sound. "The child of a gutter snipe? She will bring nothing but scandal and shame to this family. She will dilute the bloodline." The ugly, archaic words hung in the air. In that moment, Julian saw his family for what they truly were. A cold, loveless institution concerned only with power, prestige, and the preservation of its own mythology. Anya had been right to be afraid of them. "Then I guess," Julian said, a slow, liberating smile spreading across his face, "that I'm no longer part of this family." He turned to leave. "If you walk out that door, you are cut off," his father roared. "You will lose everything. The company, your inheritance, all of it." Julian paused at the door and looked back at them, at their shocked, disbelieving faces. "You don't understand," he said softly. "I already have everything I could ever want." He walked out of that cold, silent mansion and didn't look back. He drove back to the country, the city lights shrinking in his rearview mirror. He was free. He arrived back at the estate to find the house bathed in a warm, welcoming light. As he walked in, he heard laughter coming from the main living area. He followed the sound and found a scene that warmed him to his soul. A fire was crackling in the large stone fireplace. Ilara was sitting in a comfortable armchair, a book in her lap, her face relaxed and happy. And Lily was on the floor, having a tea party with a collection of stuffed animals, her tutor playing along with enthusiastic delight. Lily looked up and saw him, her face breaking into a wide grin. "Daddy, you're home." Mr. Snuggles was just about to have another biscuit. Daddy. She had never called him that before. The simple, beautiful word landed in his heart and took root. He walked over and knelt on the floor, joining the tea party without a second thought. He accepted a tiny, imaginary cup of tea from his daughter and felt a wave of peace so profound it almost brought him to tears. This was his family. This was his company. This was his inheritance. Later that night, after he had tucked Lily into bed and read her a story, he stood on the terrace, looking up at the star-filled country sky. It was so different from the light-polluted haze of the city. He could see everything clearly. He thought about the fortune he had walked away from, the empire he had abdicated. He felt no regret, only a deep, abiding sense of rightness. He had spent his life accumulating wealth, a cold, sterile substitute for the love he had lost. But true wealth wasn't measured in stock portfolios or real estate holdings. It was measured in moments like these, in the sound of a child's laughter, in the warmth of a shared memory, in the quiet peace of a home filled with love. He thought of Anya, and for the first time, the memory brought not pain, but a gentle, smiling warmth. He could almost feel her presence beside him, her head on his shoulder. "You found her, Julian," she seemed to whisper on the wind. "You found our secret sky." He looked up at the moon and at the single, bright star that seemed to stand watch beside it, and he smiled. His life was no longer a constellation of one. He was no longer a lonely star. He was part of something bigger, something brighter, something infinitely more beautiful. He had finally found his way home. This new chapter would be written not in boardrooms and financial reports, but in the everyday, extraordinary language of love, a language he was finally, joyfully, beginning to understand. The path ahead was uncertain, but for the first time, he wasn't afraid. He had his daughter, his family, and a sky full of stars to guide him. And he knew with a certainty that settled deep in his bones that this was only the beginning. The world may have seen him as a billionaire who had lost his fortune, but he knew the truth. He had never been richer.